Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my NACL week number 3 overview and analysis video. We are really getting into the nitty-gritty. This is the second half of the NACL regular season already in week number 3. After this, which has already happened by the way, week 4, our super week is kicking off, and that's the end of the regular season. It's single round robin, best of 1, and so you really got to kick it into gear or step aside by this point with so much on the line for every single one of these teams. Remember, top 8 ends up making playoffs, and so you don't have to be perfect. You just have to make sure you are not bottom 2, and so we will see how that ends up going. If you guys are excited, let me know down in the comments section below. What did you expect to happen this week, and did it live up to your expectation, or were you surprised by the outcome? Of course, I'll be going over everything, but if you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of the video, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We'll be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 10 at the end of the video as well, kind of talking about whether or not I think teams are getting better or getting worse, depending on some roster changes or just general cohesion, because there's so little to go off of here in the NACL, but I'll be doing my best. But most of today, of course, will be spent talking about the games themselves. So let's jump into day number 1. This is the final regular-sized week, so theoretically 10 best of 1s to go over. Obviously, it wasn't quite that simple in terms of how things ended up breaking down, which we will talk about, but let's get into our first game here, and it's a big one. It's a matchup between DarkZero and Supernova, and Supernova is going to pick up the win here. They're going to move to 5-0 to start the split. They are the clear-cut number 1 team right now in the NACL in terms of expectations and in terms of what they are delivering. This is a super team that has come together to promote into the LTA over Disguised, and honestly, they are everything they were hyped up to be and then some. I know that there were some concerns about some individual players and whether or not they'd be able to carry maybe some spring form into summer, or whether or not they'd be able to carry some form from last year into summer of this year in a Blaze Olive's case, but everything is just working out for Supernova. They're super clean, super calm, and they're great at team fighting, and it really does separate them because DarkZero is a good team. Now, they might not be a perfect team. We saw that in their first loss last week to Luminosity Gaming, where they did have their own sets of problems. Like, this is a team that really dominated a lot of the early games because they were going into teams that they could just hands check, and I think the moment they had to start making more decisions against better teams, or that they were losing in the early game, things got a little bit more difficult for them. I still believe that this is a top 3 team in the NACL, but after losing pretty definitively to the top 2, I think it's pretty clear-cut to rule them out of that particular narrative. So let's get into it. Player of the game for me for Supernova is going to go to a Blaze Olive, although I think it's pretty up for debate who you want to give this to. There are multiple fantastic options, but I have to reward ABO's pentakill at the end of this game on the Aurora. It really was, it was the game-ending play, but it completely broke open everything, and it was very well played by everyone involved. Broadcast ended up giving player of the game to Hoarder. I think the chat ended up voting on that. I certainly can't disagree with that either. Top lane was hugely in favor of Supernova, which is one of the biggest reasons why this team is as good as they are, because they might just have the best top laner in the NACL right now, which nobody could have predicted. I'm high on Hoarder. I was singing his praises all split in spring on Conviction, kind of talking about how he was the breakthrough star in the top lane position, but it's all happened so fast. This guy has been absolutely incredible. I would argue he has been the most productive top laner so far in summer. Again, it's best of 1s, and so you don't want to freak out too much. But like Hoarder or Fake God, right now, like Hoarder really has been that guy in the NACL. But I'm still giving it to a Blaze Olive because he was just as good, in my opinion, in the mid lane, and I think he had the bigger pop-off play. I think that there are other options for this. Scary Jerry, I think, has been so consistent in the bot lane. He's been everything he was hyped up to be, and then some. I was actually a little concerned that his play was going to go down from what it was in the NACL last year, mostly because I just thought it was the perfect surrounding core for a player like Jerry to have a jungler like Yuji, to have a top laner like Zamudo in that kind of instance. I wasn't sure that Dardoch and Hoarder were going to be able to offer the same kind of pressure, but Jerry, turns out, is just a very good player that has consistently gotten better over the course of his entire career. Breezy has really kept his form up from spring as well. Not that Breezy's ever been a bad player, but this is really the first time that he's been asked to be on a top-tier team in Tier 2, and he is living up to the billing after, again, in my opinion, being the best support in the spring split, at least in terms of raw production. I thought he was the one across the regular season that was the most consistent and the most positive towards his individual team. So everything just working. I didn't even mention Dardoch, but he was running the league last week. He was the guy pushing Supernova forward, and I think he's going to be in the MVP conversation in a best of 1 shortened split. So Everything just clicking for a 5-0 Supernova, and you just gotta like the way that they're playing. Big favorites right now. And for DarkZero on the other side, I don't want to be too critical, because again, their only losses are to the two best teams in the league, but at the end of the day, you kind of have to beat the two best teams in the league. This team doesn't want to get third, they want to get first in terms of where they're sitting. It feels like they kind of lost their way a bit after losing Yuji in the jungle. You know, obviously Zamudo was still very good for them, but going for that 10-man roster in the spring split and not everything working out, and then Zamudo getting picked up by Lion in the LTA, and you've got Spyrax, you know, not staying with Maryville because he graduated, and, you know, all of this stuff, not wanting to play in Tier 2 at the end of this year, so Toasty comes in. It just ends up being kind of a downer right now because this team feels like they're capped a little bit near the top of the standings, but not at number 1, which is frustrating. K is going to get dud of the game here for me on the top side. It really did feel like Quarter was significantly better, not only in terms of the 1v1, but definitely in terms of their effect on the map, and that should not happen entirely in the Gwen versus Jax matchup. It's not the easiest matchup in the world for something like Gwen, but really, K should have had more of an impact here, and I just don't think he was good enough. He was incredible at the start of the split, but, you know, we're starting to run into a bit more, you know, up and down moments from him, and I think this is more of what we expected with him coming up from the LRN. Kisno has also struggled a bit more. Dardoch has full map control in a lot of instances, but Kisno just trading a little bit too aggressively, times where he's too far forward. I think everyone else was generally okay. Toasty, Sajed, Zyko, I don't think that they were the problem in this one. It's just difficult to beat Supernova if everybody's not playing great. Like, even if you're just not the problem, if you have 5 players who are not the problem, Supernova's still going to be able to pick up that win. This is a team that needs to be able to elevate, and you need to have all 5 players be willing and capable to step up and be top of their roles, and I'm just not sure that they have that right now. They're a good team. It feels like they're just a little bit away from being a great team. And for Supernova, like I said, they are the peak right now in the NACL. I know it's best of ones. You don't want to freak out too much, but this team looks so consistent. Even if they drop a best of one at some point in the regular season, it's going to be hard to change my mind at this point that they're favorites going into playoffs, just because of how good they looked for basically every game that they started off the split with. And you don't want to overreact to small sample size, but this team looks as advertised, and if that's going to be the case, they're not only easily going to be number 1 in the NACL, they are very likely going to take that LTA spot. But then moving on to our second game of the video, or what would be our second game of the video, we have to talk about the forfeit that comes in Conviction versus Blue Otter. There's a tournament realm problem for Conviction. They have to forfeit the game. It's a pretty consequential thing to happen. I don't want to speak too long on it because I don't have a graphic or anything to throw up on the screen for it, but I do want to talk about why this is relevant, because Blue Otter needed this. Like, this is actually ginormous for them. This is a free win, and this is their second win. This is, you know, win number 2. This could be the kind of win that keeps them out of the bottom 2, and they got it through forfeit. Obviously, they bring in Kryra in the middle of the week to, you know, they're not the only team bringing in a former Maryville jungler, a former DarkZero jungler in the middle of the split, but they bring in Kryra to try and stabilize, and we'll see a little bit later this week how that ends up working out. But regardless of whether you thought they were going to win or lose this game, for them to be able to pick up a win here is gigantic for their ability to survive and not be bottom 2, to not have to go in to the promotion relegation tournament. For Conviction, it's not that detrimental because, again, this is a team that started off so hot. They're still above 500 even with this free loss. They were 3-1 going into the week, so they go down to 3-2. But again, for Blue Otter, who was sitting at 1-3 before this, at 2-3, it's looking a lot more doable for them to do this. And they were underdogs going into this game. It was very possible they came out of this at 1-4 and were genuinely looking like a bottom 1, bottom 2 team in the NACL. Outside of that, this is a huge result for them. So again, no graphic, and it's a big extenuating circumstance, and so I don't want to go too much into it, but it's a big win for Blue Otter. But that transitions nicely into the next game. We actually can talk about game number 3, technically, of day number 1. Dorado Gaming taking on Winthrop University, and Dorado picking up a big victory here as well. We just talked about how important it was for Blue Otter to get that win over Conviction through forfeit to get to 2 wins, and Dorado does the same here by moving themselves to 2-3 and moving Winthrop to 2-3. This is becoming very crowded at the bottom of the standings, which makes things a lot more interesting, and Dorado is really starting to find their form. I talked about this so much in the first week and in the second week. Really, their first 3 series were against some of the best teams in the entire league. They had to play, I believe it was DarkZero, Supernova, and Citadel in their first 3 series, and it's like, yeah, of course they went 0-3. Those are 3 of the most talented, like, LCS pro teams in the entire league, and so it makes sense that they're starting to find their form and pick up some steam, but I really do think it's in the areas that you would want to see the most. It's the middle of the map, and it's the young guns that are really starting to pick up the pace. But really, at the core of it, it's Shochi in the mid lane, who's going to get yet another player of the game. Actually, I believe this is his first. For me, this split, because their first win, I think I gave it to Kaido in the jungle, because I thought he was great in that game, but Shochi really is the core. He is the rock of Dorado Gaming, and we'll get more into Kaido in just a second, but Shochi just, you guys know, like, I've been going on this rant since 2022, since he was on Cincinnati Fear, since I've really been pushing for him. This guy is incredibly talented. His hands are very strong. He's a very good skirmisher. I think that's really where he excels as a player, but it's his mental, it's his macro that really kind of separates him from a lot of the other players at this level. I've called him the jungle whisperer in the past, and we'll talk about it. It's happening again. Like, you can just, it's so reliable with Shochi that he just makes every jungler he plays with infinitely better. Not that those players are bad. I want to make that clear, but just, you know, the track record with Shochi is flawless at this point, but he just continues to always have pressure in lane. He's so good in the 1v1s, and he landed some huge Shuriman shuffles in this game on the Azir. I'm so on the Shochi train. There's no excuse for this guy not trying to compete to get into LTA North, in my opinion. I still believe, from a talent level, this guy is a top 4-ish mid laner in the NACL, like somewhere in that zone. He's just not really gotten a chance to prove it. And I'm excited to see that on this team where he really is like a leader. He's the only player that has spent a full split, I guess outside of, you know, Kaido. I believe he played a full split in the NACL back in, what was it, 2022, 2023? Could be wrong. Like, it might have been half a split. He might have split some time, but he's played here before. I believe Shochi is the only player to, at the very least, have playoff experience for Dorado Gaming, I guess, outside of Sushi. These are a lot of caveats, a lot more than I thought. Sushi being a sub, of course, for Near Airport last split. But you get what I'm trying to say. Shochi's the veteran on this team with experience, and he's living up to it. He's been phenomenal for this team, and I think he's going to be big for them down the stretch as well if they want to stay out of the bottom two. But it's Kaido who's really grown a lot and really started to express himself in the jungle. And again, I don't want to give all the credit to Shochi, because that's not fair. Kaido has done a great job to make strides and developments, and he was doing that before he joined up with Shochi here on Dorado. He had been getting better over the past couple of years in Tier 3, but it is noticeable that every jungler that Shochi plays with all of a sudden has really great map control in the mid game. It's something he's really good at prioritizing because he's such a good shove and row mid laner that can play for the map. He's so good in lane that he's able to create these advantages for his jungler, but Kaido is doing so well to take advantage of it. He's actually having like a pseudo breakout split for me in the jungle. His tape has been really excellent to watch. I'm just hopeful that this is something that can keep up. You know, obviously small sample size with best of ones. You don't want to read into it too much, but Kaido has been really, really good and really fun to watch. Sushi, I think, just had his best game of the entire split. He's somebody who I think a lot of people were expecting more out of because he was so good in his small sample size for Near Airport. I was more cautious about Sushi going into the split because I think his Tier 3 tape was more hit or miss than his tape on Near Airport, and he didn't have, you know, Pobelter and Spica. All due respect to Kaido and Shochi, it's just a bit of a different ballgame when you're playing with those two, and I think he has struggled a bit more, but he's starting to find his footing again. Big Kaisa game from him. Mixture was good. Ariana was very good on the top side. Dorado just felt a lot more complete as a team, and this is a big win from a standing standpoint, so nice stuff from Dorado. And then for Winthrop on the other side, a bit of a disappointing loss. This is a team I really did believe in, but honestly, they're in danger of being bottom two. I'm not going to say that they are bottom two right now, but it's a real concern when it comes to Winthrop that, you know, a couple of mistakes and they are not in a great spot moving forward. It really is that contested. Only 35 is going to be the player that gets the dud of the game for me. It was tough to give one out because it really more so felt like Dorado making good plays rather than Winthrop just getting throttled, but I do think the lane matchups were not necessarily ideal in terms of how the 1v1 or 2v2s ended up going. Only 35 in particular went for some aggressive engages on the Leona that really got punished, and by the time we hit the late game, he was just fodder for Azir ultimates or, you know, Xin Zhao diving in and just knocking him up and killing him. Like, the free engages that happened because of the Leona were just not ideal, so only 35 is going to be the one that gets dead of the game for me, but I think you could give this to Wilson in the jungle, who really lost pressure early. I think you can give this to Sword in the mid lane, who again was not pushing at all. Like, Shochi was much better in lane and is the better mid laner, and that was clear. Winthrop just wasn't as good as Dorado, and I think from a hands perspective, you could have theoretically predicted that. I gave Winthrop a lot of credit going into the split. I think that I had them 5th in my pre-split power rankings because I thought that they were actually going to take advantage of this best of one system as one of the only teams to fully, you know, have the same starting 5 from last split, but it's really not worked out like that. Winthrop has already started to show some cracks in the armor, and I think a better league now than what we had in spring is kind of exposing the fact that Winthrop was already a borderline top 6 team in spring, and the league got better. So it kind of is what it is. But big win for Dorado. It keeps them active. I'm excited to see them later on in the week, but this team is looking good right now. Then moving on to our fourth game of day number 1, and this was a pretty big matchup. I think every single player in this game has played in LCS. It's not entirely confirmed. I'll have to confirm that, but it is Citadel Gaming taking on Luminosity Gaming. The only one I don't remember is Bradley, if he ever got a game or two on Team Liquid or anything like that when he was in the organization, but the point stands that these are 10 of the most reliable and consistent top-tier performers in North America going toe-to-toe in Tier 2, and Luminosity is going to pick up the win here. They really needed this one. They have not been the team that we thought they would be at the start of this split. Now, part of that is roster problems. Of course, Mini coming into the mid lane last week as a replacement for Insanity, who was unavailable. It's a really awkward time for that to happen because they played Supernova and DarkZero, the other two best teams in the league last week, and they had to have a sub mid in for that. But even the 2-2 start, they lost to CCG in week number 1. This team was not perfect in the first couple of weeks, but again, best of 1, there's quite a lot of time, at least for them to figure things out going into playoffs, and this does seem like an improvement in terms of where their form is at. For Citadel, unfortunately, it just doesn't feel like this team is as elite as maybe I wanted them to be. You probably could have taken some of that away from the promotion tournament, where while they were very good, like there was a reason they didn't end up qualifying in spring, they qualified in summer. I still think this is a very good team, and I think in any given situation, like give them a month, like let them go into playoffs and start to get their form under them, especially in best of, fives, best of threes, things like that. Like I could absolutely see this team leveling up, but for now, I do still have questions about whether or not they can be top 4. So let's go ahead and get into it. For Luminosity, player of the game is going to go to Insanity in the mid lane on the Ahri. Really hard to go any other direction on this one. This was an awesome game, an insane game, if you will, from Insanity as a return to the NACL. Congratulations to him coming back and looking so good. He had looked okay in week 1. I would actually argue he wasn't great in week 1. He was pretty bad in their loss to CCG, and so I was really interested to see what kind of form he was going to be in coming back, and obviously I wasn't a huge fan of how he played in spring outside of specifically the finals. Like, he was incredible in the finals, completely obliterated DarkZero, and won them a championship, but like outside of that, like the regular season, he was probably the least productive player on Luminosity. So coming back and seeing him dominate on Ahri into Bradley, a very good mid laner, is a very good sign. Again, you're just hoping that he can be top 1 in the role, and if not top 1, top 2, like at bare minimum. And I think that that's super realistic for someone like Insanity to be able to reach. There are a lot of good mid laners. Blaze Olive has started off incredibly hot. He's probably been number 1 in terms of the tape so far, but Insanity at his best can absolutely overtake that number 1 spot. But it was the rest of the team as well. I want to make that clear. Zeyzal had a great game on Alistair. Something clicked for him, I think, in like week 6 or 7 of the regular season in spring, and he's not really looked back. He was excellent at the end of the regular season there. He went into the playoffs and was huge for Luminosity Gaming throughout their entire playoff run, and he's been great at the start of this split as well. This is the best I think he's played in quite a while, like even going back to maybe the Cloud9 Challengers days, like, a couple of years ago. That was probably the last time that Zeyzal really felt this good in Tier 2. Not that he's ever been bad, but he feels elite right now in terms of how he's able to create things, and that is a very good sign. Of course, you could say the same thing for Tactical, although I don't think he's been quite as good as he was in spring. He was clear-cut the number 1 ADC in spring. I think there's much more competition with Scary Jerry back in the league now, but I think he's rebounding well from a decently poor week number 2 where he needed to be a bit better positioning-wise. Tomio was good. Fake Gob was good. Tomio specifically was much better than Kenvi in this particular matchup, which is ginormous for Luminosity moving forward, so really not a negative thing to say about Luminosity. Just a pretty solid win for them, and it's a frustrating loss for Citadel, not because they're supposed to win this one. Even if they were the team that I thought they were, like a top 4 team, that they're not beating Luminosity. Like, that's not something that's supposed to happen. It just feels like things aren't clicking for this team in the way that maybe they want to right now. I think they, of course, have the talent to be able to figure that out. Like I said, at bare minimum, 4 LCS players, and then Bradley, who's been an NACL or a Tier 2 champion, an Academy champion before. Like, this is a team full of players who should be at the top of this level. It's just not, like, the synergy doesn't seem to be there right now. Diamond feels quite a bit disconnected. He's going to get dud of the game once again here. He just feels like he's not quite on the same engage angle as maybe everybody else. A lot of the rel engages ended up going quite wide or were, not perfectly timed in this. And I think it's just when you have such an engage-heavy comp with things like Rel and Wukong, and then even like a Scion Silas to follow it up, not really a ton of damage, you need to make sure that your lockdown is nearly perfect, and it just didn't feel like everything was layered correctly. Diamond also wasn't as involved as maybe I wanted him to be in this game, but that's generally just been the case for the Citadel bot lane so far. Kenvi, I think, had a rough game. He's been okay at the start of the split. Hopefully he gets better. Tomio's a very good player. Philip also struggled on the top side. He's been a very good tank player, but Fake God has kind of been beating up on everybody. So I don't want to freak out about this this loss for Citadel. I still think they have more than enough talent and, firepower at their disposal to turn things around, but it is a bit concerning that they're sitting below 500 at 2-3, over halfway done with the split technically. But for Luminosity, big win here at 3-2. We'll see where both of these teams go on day number 2, because I think their record coming out of week number 3 is really important towards what they're going to kind of project as moving forward. But at least for now, this is one of those wins that Luminosity's happy to get, and probably one that Citadel is going to want back. But that brings us to our 5th and final game of day number 1 and the end of the first half of the week. It was the winless Vancouver Impact taking on CCG Esports, and Vancouver Impact is going to pick up a massive victory here. They are going to get the 46-minute banger win over CCG. This is not only huge for, obviously this game was really fun to watch, and you had like a base race style ending, don't hit the Nexus first because you're going to die trying to kill the Nexus and the enemy team's going to go take it. Obviously, that's always a really fun way for a game to end, but also for Vancouver Impact, if they had lost this, they're like signing their ticket into bottom 2. Not that it would have been guaranteed. Obviously, statistically speaking, you can still survive if you're 0-5, depending on how the rest of the league is going, but especially with Dorado's win earlier and with Blue Otter picking up that win earlier on the day, like Vancouver Impact sitting at 0-5 if every other team is at 2 wins, it's not looking good for them to get out of the bottom 2. They needed this, and this win is huge for them. It comes off the back of their new jungler coming in. Will is unfortunately out, and Shimmer is in, of course, former jungler for Maryville, and for DarkZero, he is coming in as the starting jungler here for Vancouver Impact, and he made his presence known in game number 1, getting player of the game for me, not just because of the, overall narrative of obviously he comes in and they immediately win their first game. That's a pretty good look, and against a good CCG team as well, that people have ranked pretty highly. I've always been a bit lower on this team, and I'll kind of talk about that as we continue to go along, but because he was the most important player in this game, not only was he super impactful on the Nocturne with that Knock-Ori combo, at being able to dive into fights and disrupt a lot of the backline so that Yunara couldn't play for free, but also he actively saved the game. When CCG is rushing down the base and about to win the game, it's Nukes and it's Shimmer that ends up turning everything around for Vancouver Impact. That salvages every negative play here, and you just have to give him a lot of credit for being a part of that. I think the Nocturne more than deserved player of the game just based off of merit alone, and we again got to see a lot of the positives, but this game wasn't quite as simple as just, okay, these two teams were close, and then eventually Vancouver Impact, won a fight and rushed the base and ended it in their own base. Like, all of that stuff obviously happened, but this was a game where VI got a huge lead in the early game, was actually in a very good spot off of Lucian, off of Nocturne, to be able to run this game, and then CCG would slowly pull the game back. They were winning fight after fight after fight. Even if they were small advantages in favor of CCG, they were pulling things back, and eventually it started to get really scary. It felt like Vancouver Impact was just going to lose their heads, that they were a team that just didn't have the macro to be able to close this out against a better and more experienced CCG, but that was not the case. They held on and they made the play when it mattered the most, and I have to give Shimmer a lot of credit for that, but I also want to point out this might be the single best game I've ever seen this bot lane play. I've been pretty low on Zev as an AD carry in terms of what I've seen on tape so far. Not that I think he's a bad player. This is tier 2. This is developmental at the end of the day. This is the area where you want to see a player grow. It was just, I need to see some of that growth start happening because it hadn't really been there in the promotion tournament for me, and I obviously haven't seen it so far on a team that's just not really looked good anywhere in the NACL, but this is the single best game Zev has ever played that I've watched. Obviously, maybe he's had better, but this is one of those performances that I'm going to remember as like, okay, there's something in there that you can really take over on the game, because his positioning in these team fights was really solid. Shogo was doing a ton of damage on Yunara, and obviously this is the first Yunara I've covered on the channel, so it's exciting in that regard, but Zev ended up outplaying him in a couple of pretty key moments, so credit to him. Nukes obviously had the gigantic 5-man ultimate to save the game at the end, and the Rel generally was pretty big. Sudsy and Dragoon, I think, were generally fine. Sudsy's been very good so far in the NACL. It does kind of feel like he's a bit stuck on this team, and maybe that's not going to be the case anymore. Maybe Shimmer's going to be able to elevate this jungle mid, and maybe the bot lane is getting better. I like Nukes as a playmaker, and Zev showed a lot in this game. Dragoon can just survive on the top side. Vancouver Impact can be a team that bounces their way back, and for CCG, this is a very, very disappointing loss. Like, I do not want to mince my words here. You can't really be losing a game like this to Vancouver Impact, not because I think they're trash and you can't really, afford it, but more so, look at the standings. You're sitting at 2-3 now, and you are actually in a dangerous position position, because this is one of the games that you kind of have to win in order to not be bottom 2 in this big cluster. And if CCG is going to struggle moving forward, they can't really afford in a small format to make this kind of mistake. And I feel bad because honestly, for a lot of the team fights of this game, they were the better team, which is why I had a really hard time picking a dud of the game. You know, I really didn't want to give one in this one. I want to make that abundantly clear. There was nobody that jumped out as dud of the game worthy. I am giving it to Fadachan in the support position. Again, if only because I think the Thresh was the least relevant on the team. I think the only other player I considered was Music in the jungle. I think it's fair to give it to Music. I think he had the lowest KP on the team, tied with Young, and that's not really great if you are a jungler. It's never really a great situation, especially for something like Trundle, Talia. For those two to be the lowest KP percent on the entire team is never ideal, but I think Fadachan was just slightly more irrelevant. But at the end of the day, CCG wins this game like 8 times out of 10, even if they play the exact same game that they played here. It just didn't end up working out. So it is what it is, but you need to see this team turn around. There is something to be said about Shogo picking up the new hyper carry in the bot lane because he's the hyper carry guy and not being able to carry the team. I'm not going to make that argument. Shogo has struggled quite a bit in tier 2. I'm not going to dogpile onto the conversation, but you know, it is what it is. They came very close and they just couldn't quite get it. And honestly, this kind of game might be the difference between getting 9th and getting 8th, and that could be really tragic for CCG, but it's a very, very big win for Vancouver Impact. They're still against the wall in terms of their ability to get out of this. They're even coming out of this day, they're still last place alone in 10th, like the only team at 1-4, but at the very least, it's not 0-5. They've climbed themselves out of the hole at least a little bit. It's all up to what they turn into the rest of the split, how this kind of progresses moving forward. But now moving on to day number 2, the second half of week number 3, and kicking that off was a matchup between Conviction and Dorado Gaming, and actually getting on the Rift for this week means that Conviction is going to pick up at least one win in week number 3. Obviously, it's pretty tragic what ended up happening to them on day number 1. Whether you want to blame them or not, I think is entirely up to you because it was just such a weird situation, but Conviction gets on the Rift, they get to play a game, and they do end up picking up a pretty dominant win. Honestly, everything we've seen from this team has showcased a top 4 team bare minimum in the NACL, and I think they have the room to be even better than that. It feels like their meta read right now is just better than a lot of the other teams, which is a crazy thing to say about a streamer team, but it is kind of the case. They're playing Janna in the bot lane after all these engaged supports have been nerfed. They're playing things like Talia, Varus, which are the 2 strongest, champions in their role. They're not worried too much about like anything else. They're playing Scion on the top side. Like Trundle's been popping off in a lot of regions. It feels like they really just have a good pulse on like what is strong in the meta right now, and they're doing really well on it. And honestly, without that FF earlier on in the week, like this team is likely sitting at what, 5-1 going into the final week of the regular season because we assumed that they would be favorites against a team like Blue Otter. Like Conviction's in a dangerous spot, and for Dorado, like obviously I'd love to be frustrated over this because we showed so much promise and praise to this team on day number 1 and they go and lose to this, but Conviction's really good. It's not one of those like, oh, I can't believe they lost to Conviction. It's like, okay, yeah, you lost to Conviction. So many teams around where you were at are going to have that same loss. So let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the game for me pretty much has to go to TF Blade on the Scion. He stood there, he ate damage, he pressed W, he pressed Q, he pressed R, and everything worked out. Like, it's just, tanks are really good, and TF Blade honestly has been really good on tanks in the NACL. I know he talks about not really liking to play them and not really being his style, but he clearly understands his role when he does pick it up, because I think he's honestly a much better player when he gets to play tanks in the NACL. Maybe that's just because tanks are better. Like, you can, spin that conversation a bunch of different ways, but I think it kind of eliminates some of the big negative traits he has in the mid game, where he can be a bit more aggressive, he can play a bit more greedy, because teams, if they do tend to focus him, are going to lose a lot of resources for doing so, and also, if they don't, then he can just kind of survive on his own. It kind of puts the other team in a conundrum when you're playing something like Scion, as opposed to playing something more aggressive. So I like it for TF Blade. We saw this on Near Airport, where he is just a little bit more efficient on these champions, and the matchup against Ariana was really fun to watch. I think both top laners played pretty well today, but TF Blade coming out on top in that regard. Want to give a big shout out to Stunt in the support position. I thought he was awesome in this game on Janna, and I continue to believe that enchanters are incredibly underplayed in the meta right now, especially with a lot of these AD carries that just kind of want to take over the game. Like, Varus is so good in a lot of different instances. You have enough setup on this team. You have Talia Wall, you've got Trundle Pillar, you've got Scion dashing in. Varus can even set up his own kills with his ultimate, and so you don't really need like an engaged support here to combo off of everything. You could use one, but with all of those engaged tanks being nerfed pretty regularly in the patch notes, why not try something like Janna? And it clearly worked for Stunt. I want to give him a lot of credit here, so I thought he played well. Viper's kind of been the main carry for this team throughout this year, at the very least the main character in terms of the amount of resources he's receiving. He was not that in this game, and you know, he wasn't really all that great, quite frankly. He didn't really have to do all that much, but if you're going to be able to win without him taking over and being super aggressive, that's also a positive. Evolved has been really good as like a shove and roam macro-oriented mid laner, which I did not expect, and Perry is Perry. Like he has been predictably very good going against his former teammate in Shochi. So everything kind of working out here for Conviction. They look awesome. Again, if they didn't have that forfeit, there is a real shot that they're coming out of this week at 5-1, and we're genuinely talking about them in the upper echelon. As it is, they're coming out 4-2, still a pretty good record, and can't really complain about that. And for Dorado on the other side, I still think this team is okay. I think they put up a pretty decent fight here. They just didn't have the firepower to compete with Conviction, who is one of the better teams in the league. Kaido is going to get my dud of the game. I feel really bad because I just hyped this guy up in the progress that he's been making over the course of the past few games and series and just splits in general, but this was not one of his best performances, I would say, on the Wukong. Very difficult to be able to play this out the moment the Trundle ends up getting ahead. That's just naturally how it's going to go with Syndra and Senna. You don't really have priority in this game. There's no way for you to control space unless you're playing from ahead, in which case it's very difficult for the enemy team to walk into a fully ranged Senna and then a Wukong and things like that. But again, how are you walking into Trundle? How are you walking into Sion? How are you walking into Janna in this comp? It's just a lot more difficult, and Kaido, I think, had a really hard time being able to execute on that. I also don't think this was Shochi's best game of all time, but I also am not the biggest fan of putting Shochi on immobile mages in the mid lane. I think he's a really good Orianna, Syndra player, like things like that, but I just want him to be able to get out on the map and play the game. Like, I understand that he can be a primary carry for your team, but I just don't know if that's the role that Dorado kind of needs him to fill right now. He needs to kind of elevate, I think, everybody else, and that wasn't able to happen on the Senna, or on the Syndra. The Senna was generally fine. Honestly, the bot lane was fine. Sushi and Mixture, I thought, played well. Former teammates going up against each other in that regard, I guess, with TF Blade and Sushi from last split, if you want to even consider that. But I thought the bot lane was fine, and top lane was generally okay. Maybe Ariana was a bit too aggressive on the Mbessa, but really, this was just one of those games where Dorado felt like they were out-tempoed, and they couldn't really get through the comp of Conviction. So, credit to Conviction. They look great. Dorado, I'm not worrying too much about this. Absolutely can still be a bottom 2 team. I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility, but so many teams were coming into the day at 2 and 3. We'll just have to see who else comes out at 2 and 4. But Conviction, like I said, coming out at 4 and 2, they look excellent. We'll see what this team can do if they actually live up to their promise in best of 5s. Like, you know, last split, this organization got 3rd with a very different roster. Who's to say they can't do that again? Then moving on now to our second game of day number 2, and it was a matchup between Vancouver Impact and Luminosity Gaming, and predictably, Luminosity did not really have trouble with this one. As much as Vancouver Impact looked better on day number 1, this is a bit of a different challenge than maybe CCG, as good as CCG is, and now that I say that, I guess CCG did beat Luminosity, so maybe I don't know what I'm talking about, but Luminosity's figuring it out. This team is moving back to 4 and 2. They're sitting in a really good spot moving into the final week of the regular season, and it feels like this team has kind of recaptured their mojo, which I think we were all just looking for. We didn't want to see this team be boring. We didn't want to see this team be average. We wanted to see them continue their dominance from the previous split, and now with teams like Supernova coming into the league, they feel particularly challenged. We wanted to see them rise up to that challenge. Right now, it feels a little bit better than maybe it did just a week or so ago when they were maybe losing games that they didn't feel they should be losing. But for Vancouver Impact, again, as much as I want to say this team is fixed and that they're going to be better moving forward, they still did dig themselves into a hole in terms of their record, and they're still not world beaters in terms of what this team is. They still have quite a few problems to talk about, even if I do think they have gotten better. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Tomio on the Maokai here. I know the chat and the broadcast ended up giving it to Insanity on the Corki for the amount of damage that he was able to output, but really when I look at what ended up making this game unplayable for Vancouver Impact, it's this idea that Tomio was constantly not only in the right place at the right time because he completely controlled the map, but even more so than that, he was everywhere in terms of stopping Vancouver Impact from making plays. It was really difficult to find a time where VI had a chance to actually push, to try to get back into the game. And that's difficult to say when you're looking at Darius and Shyvana as a top side of the map for Vancouver Impact. But the Maokai controlled space very well. The objective control from Luminosity was near perfect. It was very difficult for VI to even try and contest any of these major, fights. And that really led to Luminosity getting a lead and free stats that they just would not relinquish throughout the the entire game, but even more so than that, once Tomio did decide to engage and fight and not just control space, but really like engage and make that a problem for VI, he was excellent at that. He goes deathless in this game. That's pretty hard to do on Maokai if you're playing him correctly, and I think Tomio was. So I did want to give him a lot of credit because I think he was really solid in this game. I get why Insanity on the broadcast ended up getting player of the game because I think it is kind of justifiable for that Corki to be the main character here, especially with the damage he was outputting, but I think Insanity's game is a lot more difficult if you don't have that front line, that setup, and that zone control coming in from Tomio. So credit to both of them. I think they had great weeks here in week number 3, and hopefully they're going to be able to keep that up. The rest of this team is great too. Fake God very quietly was incredible. Scion's been a really big pick on the top side across the NACL throughout all of this year, even going back to the spring split. So it's not particularly surprising to see someone as good as Fake God be able to pilot it well and be the better top laner by a lot. I also didn't really mention Insanity kind of bodied the mid lane matchup. Corki should not be getting that big of a lead in the early game. He was up like 40, 50 CS, something ridiculous. Zeyzal continues to be excellent, like truly excellent. #1 support levels of gameplay right now coming out of Zeyzal. And Tactical obviously is very good. Hasn't been the main character of Luminosity in the same way that he was in the spring split, but has still been very solid. So no real complaints, no real additions. Luminosity looked great across week 3. And for Vancouver Impact on the other side, you know, we kind of got to see the other end of the coin. They probably should have lost on day number 1 with all things, you know, kind of moving against them. They didn't, and I'm not saying that they deserved to lose and that they did not deserve to win. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm saying is that, you know, this is more kind of the return to earth that I think we expected. Shimmer wasn't quite able to take over on his signature Shyvana here in the jungle in the way that he wanted, and quite frankly, this top side was just not very good in this game in particular. Dragoon is going to get dud of the game on that Darius on the top side, and hopefully he's figuring stuff out. I don't think he's been particularly good to start off this split, but it's Dragoon. He has experience not only winning tier 3, as he's done very consistently, but being somebody who's played and at least survived at tier 2 before. You know, it hasn't been a good look. I think especially going up against the top laners in tier 2, it's not really looked like he's competitive. It's not really looked like he can hold his own in that regard, but I still think he has the talent to be able to do so. Hopefully he can turn things around, but I think we saw the bot lane kind of regress back, even though they weren't the problem here. Sudsy, I still think has been solid, but he probably had one of his weaker, if not his weakest, game of the entire split here, where especially in lane, man, that Sylas needs to be pushing the advantage a bit more into the Corki, and it just did not happen. This is a very slow comp, which you wouldn't necessarily think with a Darius and a Sylas and things like that, but it's really hard for Shyvana to feel involved unless you give her time to be able to scale up, and the problem with that is that you're trying to match Maokai Corki on the other side with that same ideology. So Vancouver Impact just kind of fell into a hole and couldn't really get themselves out of it. This is more the result we expected, I think, going into the week, but at least they're at 1-5 and not 0-6, because that would be genuinely a disaster and probably a death sentence for this team heading into the final week, but they still have life in them. Luminosity are just better, and they're sitting at 4-2, and even that record is probably a bit disingenuous to how good they actually are. This is not a team that's competing to be top 2. They are definitively top 2 as long as they play their own game. Right now, I'm not saying it's a complete 2-horse race with them in Supernova, but in terms of talent, that's absolutely where they should be. Then moving on now to our middle game of day number 2, and it's the first time we've seen this team this week because of that forfeit. It's DarkZero taking on Blue Otter with their new jungler coming in. Unfortunately, the jungle change doesn't go quite as well for Blue Otter as it did for Vancouver Impact, as DarkZero picks up the win here, and they do so in a decently competitive game. It's just a much better game plan from DarkZero, a risky fight coming in from Blue Otter around Otacon that ends up not going their way, and the game just kind of spirals out of control from there. It's really well done by DZ. I hate to say it, this really does feel like a hands diff in terms of how this game ended up breaking down. It just felt like they fought a little bit better. They had a better game plan in the early game, and mid lane was heavily in favor of DarkZero throughout this game, and that makes it very difficult for Blue Otter to come back. And I say all of this, right? But this is like best of one bonanza, right? Like this is just how best of ones end up breaking down. It's really hard to get a clear grasp on where these teams are landing, just generally because of the way that things are set up. So, you know, don't take this too seriously to be like, oh, mid-gap, like Toasty way better than Samikin. It's one game, but you know, Toasty deserves the credit, and he's going to get player of the game for this because it was an incredible performance from him. Sajed would have been in the conversation, I think, for player of the game had he not got solo killed. Zyko was in the conversation for me as well because I thought he played great, but Toasty was really the main character for DarkZero, and the mid-gap here was pretty large. Not only was he, you know, already doing well in the 1v1, but then he starts getting attention from Kizno, he starts getting attention from Zyko, and things really start spiraling out of control control for Samikin. Toasty starts getting really fed, and this Victor just ends up dominating in the late game. Like, once he started rolling, those ultimates dropping down on a fight, his positioning, and it's just his raw damage output coming in was basically unstoppable for DarkZero. So credit to Toasty. I've gone on and on and on this channel about how I think he's the next, like, Surdy, Yuji, Zamudo kind of player to come out of the NACL. I really do think he's that good. I don't know if he's there right now, but, like, the trajectory that this guy is on, maybe this is an unfair comparison, but he honestly reminds me a ton of Jojo Pune in terms of just like how quickly it's like this guy is really that good. Do I think he's that good? Probably not, right? Like, I don't think he's ever going to be Jojo. Jojo was obviously Jojo, even from like a very, small amount of time, but just in terms of the growth trajectory, it's crazy how much better this guy gets almost every single time you watch him. And I think an actual fair comparison as a prospect might be something like Kenvi or something like Scary Jerry if you want to do something more modern where it's just, this slow ascent to being the best prospect in your role in the NACL that is likely to get an option. I mean, he was considered for Disguised this split. Like, I'm honestly shocked they didn't go for him because I love Darkwings and I think he's a good player, but I think Toasty is somebody that I would love to bring in. Like, I would love to have Toasty on an LTA roster. Like, that's just the kind of guy I'm looking out for. But again, like I said, the rest of this team was great. Bot lane was really good here. Sajed was pretty excellent outside of the solo kill that he ended up suffering in this game. Zyko, though, was terrific on the Poppy. I want to see him play this champion more. I mean, obviously, I'm the biggest Poppy defender. Maybe not defender, because it's not like anyone's pushing against that narrative, but I'm the biggest Poppy pusher in the entire universe. I think this champ is pickable every game. Like, there's very little situations to me that Poppy is not relevant in somewhere on the map. Support, top lane, or jungle. Somewhere in the midst. Hell, even mid lane. I don't even care at this point. Just draft Poppy and put her somewhere. As long as you have someone who can play her, as well as Zyko played her in this game, then it's probably going to be fine. Kizno and Kay on the top side were also generally okay. Kryra actually had a pretty good game on the Wukong. I thought he did a good job in the early game of establishing pressure. He just kind of lost control because his middle of the map got destroyed. But overall for DZ, this was a solid victory, and it comes again once off the back of these players that have been in the organization all year long. Toasty, although he was kind of a sub, and then Sajed and Zyko as the starting bot lane. And for Blue Otter, again, I don't want to like freak out or panic or anything. It's a best of one loss to DarkZero, and that's kind of expected, but this is the only game Blue Otter played all week because of that forfeit, and they were lucky to be able to pick up that win over Conviction, because I'm not sure they would have beaten Conviction if they had actually played them, even with Kryra coming in. And again, Kryra is another player who I've really pushed for. Kryra, of course, going against his former organization here in DarkZero, who he played for in the spring split, being replaced by Kizno and kind of really showing up. I thought he had a pretty good game here on the Wukong. He just couldn't really take over. I think Kryra is a massive upgrade to low jazz. I even think Kryra is an upgrade over Keel, who was the original intended starting jungler here for Blue Otter. We'll see how that ends up aging, because I really like Kryra, another player that I'm willing to plant my flag on and be like, this guy I think could be a top tier jungler in the NACL by like now, like if you really wanted to invest in him. But really, this game got out of control in a different way. Samikin's dead of the game. Like, it's just hard. He so many resources put into shutting down this Aurora, and it worked. Like, the Aurora was not useful. You can blame that on Samikin. You cannot blame it on Samikin. It's up to you. But really, at the end of the day, this champion not being relevant in this game was a gigantic problem, and Toasty getting so far out of control was also basically a snowball that they just couldn't stop. So, rough game for Samikin. I think at this point, we're getting a bit concerned. He's starting to get targeted pretty frequently in every draft. Obviously, you have to ban Zoe against him, but even things like Talia are now being taken off the board because teams just feel super comfortable putting on something that has to be aggressive, and it's just not necessarily working out. I think Quacker actually played okay as well. Even Array and Rovex, like, I'm not blaming them entirely. It was a difficult game to win when you didn't have any pressure in the middle of the map, and like I said, this really just did come down to a hand stiff in favor of DZ, who I think is just the more mechanically talented and better team in terms of execution, and that's really it. Blue Otter are still very much in danger. They would have been even more in danger likely if they had actually played Conviction, but luckily they're sitting at 2-4 with a lot of other teams in the mix. If they can have a good final week, they're still going to be fine. Remember, you just need to not be bottom 2. They already did this in the spring split. We'll see if they can survive again. But for DarkZero, they're pushing for more. They end at 4-2, just like we talked about with Luminosity, with Conviction near the top of the standings. It's a big cluster there as well. And this is a team that's trying to push to be better than third, to not be just another team. If they can continue to grow, I think they could have one of the scarier carry duos in the entire league. Then moving on to game number 4 here of day number 2, and this is another really big one of two teams sitting at 2 and 3. It's Winthrop University taking on CCG Esports, and Winthrop University picks up a big win here. Not a good week for CCG. They really needed to avoid this 0 and 2 because they're in a pretty bad spot moving into the final week, sitting at 2 and 4. Of course, it's not doomed, as we talked about. A lot of teams are going to be in that cluster around 2 and 4, but Winthrop getting to 500, getting to 3 and 3 is actually a major boon for them. This is a team that had looked like, competition-wise, they would likely be in contention for a bottom 2 spot. But again, this win cannot be overstated just how ginormous it is, and they earned it. They were better here today. CCG let a lot of the power picks that Winthrop is really known for through the draft. Things like Denethor's Camille, things like Only 35's Rakan that have been really consistent for this team throughout basically the entirety of the year, and they didn't really have an answer to it. It didn't feel like they had a good idea of what they wanted to do. Shogo actually did have a really good game here on the Jhin, but how much are you going to do on Jhin when you're going into Camille? This is an immobile AD carry getting dove by one of the best Camille players in North America, so it ends up really not working out. But player of the game to me was very easy. It's going to Wilson in the jungle. Really great game from him on the Xin Zhao, and I'm really excited to see that. I've not exactly always been 2 feet in on Wilson in terms of his tape. I think that there have been some positives and some negatives at the tier 2 level. Sword has really been the one that I've kind of gravitated towards in terms of what he's been so far in 2025, but Wilson really stepped up, and I know the KDA doesn't show that. 11-2-6 versus the 11-2-12. Very much a different story in that regard, but all of the big plays were kind of made by Wilson diving in and making things happen for Winthrop. So really big credit to him. He really just outplayed Music. Music did not have a particularly good week here for CCG, but just kind of played around his comp well and played the Xin Zhao power spike incredibly well. Sword was also excellent in the mid lane, way better than Young on the other side of this. I love when Sword gets the chance to actually win in lane. He's done it really well and really consistently over the course of this year. And I don't think that's the reputation he necessarily gets as a player right now. But every single time he's kind of been unlocked, and he's not so much been on, Talia and Ryze. And I'm not saying those champions are bad or the control mages or anything like that. When you put him on like an assassin or an actual carry in the mid lane, something like Ahri that wants to play more aggro and wants to skirmish a bit more, he's really good in that role. And I've been really impressed with Sword's tape. And quite frankly, he's been better than Young. And I think we saw that in this game. Only 35 had a couple of big plays. Like I talked about, you gave Denethor Camille. That's something that really should not be happening in 2025. You should know better than that, even if you are going to leave something like Camille up, because I don't think you necessarily need to ban it out in a game like this. Don't go blind, Rumble. Like, don't pick something that is like super exploitable by a Camille. Don't pick Jhin, Orianna, Rumble, like no mobility carries that can just get locked down by the Camille. It's really not a good idea. Mobility was solid, wasn't really all that important in this game, but was definitely along for the ride. But like I said, huge win for Winthrop and a really important turning point for them. And for CCG, this is a bad loss. Like, this is a situation that they do not want to be in at 2 and 4. 0-2 week for them. We'll see if they are, the only team that ends up going 0-2 by the end of the week, but certainly not what they were looking for. Young is the pretty easy choice, I would say, for dud of the game here, coming out of the mid lane on the Orianna. He was down early. He was getting dove often. He was out of position in team fights. Just not a great game from Young, but I don't think it was just him. I think Music ended up playing this quite poorly on the Jarvan as well. I don't think Music played well across the 2 games, but it's a small sample size. I think that there were good moments for Music earlier on in the split. They just weren't quite there in this particular week. He needs to be able to rebound. This middle of the map in particular really needs to be able to rebound in order for this team to be competitive. I think Fadachan was generally fine, but also he was really like irrelevant in their 2 games that they played. He just wasn't really a factor on these engaged supports, and that does frustrate me. Thresh, Alistair, these are playmakers. These are champions that kind of need to get themselves involved in a lot of the action, and it just didn't feel like that was happening. Again, the only player that I can give a lot of credence to for this particular performance is Shogo, but he was on Jhin going into this super dive comp, so it's really tough to imagine a world where he actually got to play the game, but he played some of these fights really well. It just wasn't enough to be able to take the team across the finish line. So for CCG, like I said, they're kind of in the danger zone now. A lot of teams sitting at 2 and 4. They're not out just yet or anything like that, but they got to turn it on in week number 3 or else things are going to get dicey really quick for them, or week number 4, I should say, or things are going to get dicey really quick for them. And for Winthrop, this is massive. Sitting at 3 and 3 gives you that kind of leeway that other teams just don't really have right now with that big cluster at 2 and 4. You'd be surprised just how how big of a difference in the standings one game will make for a team like this. This matchup could have been the difference between them being in contention for bottom 2 and them being in the top 8, and we saw what happens once they got into the best of stage in the playoffs, even just last split. This is a team that can figure it out and turn it on at the right time. They have a good meta read. I think they're starting to figure out their own play style, and honestly, I still believe in this Winthrop team. But that's going to bring us to our final game of the week here, and this was a big one, a huge upset as we saw Citadel Gaming taking on Supernova. And Citadel Gaming is going to pick up the 34-minute win. I seriously did not see this coming, and I get that it's best of one, and anything can really happen in a best of one. Anybody can take down anybody in this environment, but Supernova losing their first game of the entire split here to a Citadel team that had really been underperforming, I would say, at least in terms of probably their own expectations. Again, when you go back and look at the OQs, I think there was reason to believe that this wasn't a top 4 team in the NACL, that they weren't significantly better than Dorado and, you know, even a Jolly Rogers, Vancouver Impact, although I do think they are better than those teams. Like, you know, 2 and 3 was not maybe all that out of the realm of possibilities. Like, that's all I'll just say, like, in terms of some of their performances. But this shows, yeah, Citadel at their best can still be that team. They can still compete near the top of the standings regardless of what they've looked like at times. If they continue to level up, they're going to be just fine. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game was so easy here. Bradley had an unbelievable performance in the mid lane on this Yone. Really great stuff. Blaze Olive has pretty clearly been the best mid laner, I would say, so far this split in the NACL in terms of lane dominance and late game team fighting, like the whole package kind of thing. You know, obviously Insanity is starting to get his feet back under him in terms of those performances, but Bradley has been, you know, up and down. We'll just say it. Like, the laning has looked good. The out of lane has looked questionable, for me at the very least, in terms of what we've seen. That was not the case at all in this one. He dominated this game from start to finish. He was able to generate a lot of pressure early on because this jungle mid duo was in lockstep throughout the entirety of the game. And then those team fights, man, Bradley took over this game. This was a star type of performance against the best team in the league from Bradley. I needed to see this because Bradley's like a really big pivot player, again, for Citadel. I know I say that term a lot because I do think it really matters, but when one player has so much agency towards a team's success, Kenvi is kind of a part of this as well, but when you have one part of the map that is so relevant towards whether or not the team can play their style or not, you need those players to be playing at their absolute best in order to make this work. And Bradley right now, I think, hasn't been playing at his absolute best. This is much more of a closer glimpse as to what that can look like in a best case scenario. And I think that's got to excite Citadel fans because this was excellent. And I don't want to take anything out of Kenvi's game here. This is one of, if not Kenvi's best game of the split up until this point. Not only did he gap Dardoch in terms of the macro in the mid game, because that's really where Citadel started to snowball this out of control, was their mid game pressure, but his ability to play these team fights on the Maokai, super impressive. This champion in particular just looked so good over the course of this week. You know, I'm interested to see if that ends up rising in popularity because of a lot of the top tier junglers really favoring a lot of these more tanky engagers. It's just a style that North America really likes to go towards, and Kenvi very much plays into that as well. Diamond probably played his best game of the entire split here in that same vein, especially because of just how unplayable this was for Scary Jerry and Breezy on the other side on that Sivir Rel. There really was no way for them to continue to interact with the rest of the game, and Instinct was solid. You know, Philip was fine on the top side, even if Hoarder was the only one pulling back gold for Supernova. This was just a good, big win for Citadel. They needed this. I had been criticizing them, not only earlier on this week in this same exact video, but even before this, like previous weeks. It just felt like they hadn't kicked it into that second gear just yet. This is the showcase that they needed to show that they are a team that can get there. And for Supernova on the other side, it's obviously a pretty disappointing loss, one that's not particularly consequential because they are sitting in a pretty commanding first place alone at 5-1. You know, they might have been tied with Conviction had things gone a bit differently this week, but they are still sitting alone in first no matter what. But this was a bit concerning because it just felt like the draft was really off in this game. Sivir is unplayable in this particular instance. There's just no way for you to ever shred through that front line. And if you're going to play a late game team comp centered around Wukong Engage alongside the Rel with Azir Sivir as backline damage and Jax kind of interrupting the flow of things for something like an immobile Varus, you can't play that into Maokai Yone. Like, it's just so difficult to actually operate there. And that's why Scary Jerry is getting done of the game. Now, don't get me wrong. Jerry had some good moments here and it wasn't entirely his fault, but man, he had some bad team fights as well in terms of positioning and getting sniped out before the fight even really started. And even when he was auto attacking, he was dealing 0 damage to anyone on the front line. It just wasn't a very good look for Jerry. It's his weakest game in tier 2 so far. I think he'll be fine. I think he'll turn it around. I think a lot of it was the draft, but I just don't think he piloted it well either, and I think that was a big issue. Breezy obviously got completely outplayed here by Diamond, but part of that is just the map pressure generated by Kenvi and Bradley in the middle of the map, and less so Breezy just not being able to play the game. Dardoch, I think, really struggled in this one. This is easily his worst game of the split up until this point. He had been awesome, like I said, on MVP, like pace in terms of what he had been at the start of this split. I'm a little bit cooled off on that just from this game alone. Again, such a small sample size. You can't really have a game this bad in terms of like turning that narrative. Hoarder is still also on MVP pace, and he still kind of backed that up in this game where he was very good on the Jax. Even Blaze Olive had a couple of moments where I think you could justify it, even if I think most of the team fights he was relatively like irrelevant, quite frankly. But Supernova is a team I'm still expecting to be the best in the league. This is just one of the losses that they're going to take, the first loss that they took as a group of 5 on stage. But for Citadel, this means so much more. We just talked about how important it was for Winthrop to get to 3-3. Think of how important it is for Citadel to try to get into that top 4 and really secure a spot where they don't have to worry as much about their first round matchup in the playoffs. You don't want to be this team sitting around, 6 or 7 in the standings, because then you're going to have to take on one of the best teams in the league in round number 1. Not an ideal set of circumstances. If Citadel is leveling up right now, if they can figure things out going into week number 4, and if they can end the split on a high note, this can still be a team that makes a lot of noise come playoff time. All right, but that is going to do it for my NACL week number 3 overview and analysis video. Up on the screen now, the updated standings after 3 weeks of action here in the NACL. Every team that is tied is just broken alphabetically. There's not too much to go off of in that range. I know they have a couple of other tie-breaking formulas that are kind of going into it right now, but it's just the easiest way to simplify it going into the final week. But remember, it's the bottom 2 teams that need to be worried. It's really the only place you can't be in order to make sure that you make it into playoffs. Top 8 end up making it, and that is directly reflected, at least in my opinion, in my power rankings, which you can see to the right of every single team from number 1 to number 10. Change is going to be how they have changed from last week to this week. Let's go over the risers and the fallers. Top of the format, like top of the table here, it's not going to change all that much. Supernova, I'm still going to have at number 1 even after their loss to Citadel. I still think they're the best team. They just lost a best of 1. I believe they're going to be just fine. But Luminosity really proving that they deserve to still come in at number 2. I know there were some questions about that after the end of week 2. I think a lot of those have been erased after week 3. DarkZero is still 3rd, but Conviction is still going to stay 4th here. I think that there was some, question about whether or not they should move up or down or anything like that. I like Conviction, and I think they're in the upper echelon. They're the best of that next group outside of the top 3. I'm just not willing to commit to them being as good as these teams that are kind of proven to be great. But this team really should be sitting at 5-1 if everything were, to go a little bit differently this week. But then you've got the rest of the table. I'm moving Citadel up to 5. Their win over Supernova was massive, and quite frankly, they're just leapfrogging CCG, who they clearly are better than in their current form. Winthrop is going to move up to 6, although I feel less good about that. Them and CCG, it's like whoever you want to take. Winthrop just beat them this week, and that's what makes it feel a little bit better to put Winthrop at 6 and CCG at 7. But then it gets to the really interesting conversation because, 7, 8, and 9 are fighting it out for that final spot. I have Dorado moving up to number 8. I think right now they are in better form than a team like Blue Otter, who just can't seem to find any sort of solution to their problem. Maybe they get there. Maybe Kryra really is the answer, and especially with an extra week to be able to practice, maybe you have a bit more time going for you. But right now I'm a bit concerned with where Blue Otter is at, and I think they are the most likely team to end in that number 9 spot. Vancouver Impact, of course, still coming in at number 10 for me despite their win, because I don't think they've gotten good enough to dig themselves out of this hole, but they've certainly given themselves a chance. So those are my power rankings. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comment section below, but let's go ahead and get into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 3. Player of the week was incredibly easy. This is going to Insanity, the mid laner for Luminosity Gaming. This is the best regular season week he has had in a very long time, and I get it. He comes back from break and the team is kind of clicking and everything works a bit better, but he really was the main character of Luminosity this week, which is not always the case for this team. In fact, it's very rarely the case for this team, and I was really excited to see that. If he can keep this form up and translate it to essentially being what he was in the playoffs and specifically the finals when this team won Spring, That's huge. That completely changes the complexity of what this team can be. That probably puts them number 1 in the power rankings. Tomio, his teammate, is going to be an honorable mention, a runner-up here. Luminosity in general was just terrific throughout the week, but TF Blade from Conviction also making the list despite only playing 1 game. That 1 game was really good, and quite frankly, there weren't a lot of consistently good players throughout the week here. So TF Blade and Tomio are my honorable mentions, but my dud of the week, unfortunately, will be going to Fadachan, the support for CCG. I don't think he was terrible. I just think he was kind of irrelevant in his 2 games on Thresh and on Alistair. I think he needed to be a lot more aggressive, specifically in the Thresh game, and I know it kind of came down to a weird ending against Vancouver Impact that just didn't kind of go their way, but really that is a game that should never have gotten out of hand, and, you know, I just haven't been impressed, quite frankly, with the support tape. I think I still need to see that this role swap was worth it for him as a player. Of course, if it got him a spot in the NACL, if Sushi was already going to replace him on Dorado, then maybe, you know, it was going to happen anyways, and you just don't worry about it, but it is a concern that it feels like he is significantly worse playing support than he was playing AD carry. So we'll have to see. Fadachan right now is my dud of the week, and Insanity is my player of the week, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We're going to be covering NACL Week 4, even though Day 1 has already happened. I haven't watched any of it, so none of this has been spoiled, but we'll be covering that on the channel as per usual. And then, of course, everything playoff related, as well as all 4 of the major regions, LTA North, LEC, LCK, and LPL. I've been casting for LPL English, as most of you know. Links to that will be in the description. I have a couple casts coming up this weekend. If you are interested, go ahead and check that out on either Twitch or YouTube. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all